If you're autistic, or perhaps a neurotypical who knows deep autism lore, you may have heard the name Dr. Grunya Sukhareva. If not, let me enlighten you. She was a Soviet child psychiatrist who may have been the first person to properly describe autism as a condition, and in many ways she was far ahead of her time, carefully detailing some features of autism that we're kind of just starting to understand, because until recently, basically nobody in the English-speaking world had ever heard of her. I go by the name Sonja Sukhareva on this channel in tribute to her incredible work. In 1925, she published a paper in Russian about what was then termed schizoid psychopathy of childhood, what we would now call autism, which was translated into German the following year, but not translated into English until 1996. And that English translation remains inaccessible unless you want to give money to the institutions that own her work. I figured out a workaround because I'm poor and stingy, and also because I disagree on principle with this information being kept behind a paywall. Dr. Sukhareva didn't have children of her own to inherit her scientific legacy, so institutions have ownership of her work, and I don't think that's right. I think it does a major disservice to the world for this information to not be fully out there. For too long, we have not really understood what autism is because Dr. Sukhareva's work has been kept in the dark. The problem goes well beyond paywalls. Even among the scientific community who have access to all sorts of academic documents that aren't available to the public, Dr. Sukhareva's work has remained obscure and is only now being uncovered in a significant way. She has long been overshadowed by the horrible, horrible Hans Asperger, who, besides being an accomplice of the small mustache man, perpetuated some really incorrect and harmful ideas about autism that we're still getting over, like the idea that it's almost exclusively a male condition. Dr. Sukhareva wrote first about autistic boys and then detailed the feminine presentation of autism in a second paper a few years later. Was sexism a factor in Dr. Sukhareva not getting the recognition she deserved for her work, particularly her writings about autism in girls? In my opinion, it looks that way. Was anti-Soviet sentiment a factor in her lack of recognition in the West? In my opinion, quite likely. Did this erasure have anything to do with her being Jewish? In my opinion, it's possible but not super likely, considering Leo Kanner managed to achieve wide recognition as an autism researcher, and he was also Jewish. The primary reason for Dr. Sukhareva's writings remaining obscure to the English-speaking world for so long may be as simple as nobody bothering to translate stuff into English, because too often we English speakers just don't bother with things that are in other languages. Most likely it's multifactorial, as many things are. Whatever the reason, I believe it's negligent, borderline criminal, to not make this information public. People need to know what's in these foundational texts. So I did what a reasonable autistic person would do. Out of a combination of spite and a thirst for knowledge, I found the German translation of Dr. Sukhareva's paper about autistic boys. Apparently the German is not behind a paywall. And I've been making my own English translation, bit by bit. I sadly do not speak German because my mom missed the boat on teaching it to me when I was little, but I know enough about the language and also about psychiatry that I've been able to translate this document with the help of Google Translate, as well as my mother. Translating from Russian would not have worked, because I don't know Russian at all, and there's also the Cyrillic writing to deal with, so I'm glad this German translation was available to make this English translation possible. Translating between German and English tends to be pretty straightforward because German and English are both Germanic languages, which is to say, they're linguistic cousins. Things don't tend to get lost in translation the way they often do when you're dealing with two languages that are very different, say English and Japanese. So I'm confident that this is an accurate translation, probably very similar to the English translation from 1996. Perhaps most significantly, as I mentioned, Dr. Sukhareva described what autism looks like in girls, a presentation that would basically be ignored until very recently, and many people still don't seem to entirely believe girly autism is a real thing. Sometimes I tell people I'm autistic and they don't believe me because I'm able to socially camouflage a lot of the time, and my interests are mostly things that are considered pretty normal, like music, animals, movies, that sort of thing. What Dr. Sukhareva had to say about the feminine presentation of autism is what I'm most interested in, for obvious reasons, but the paper about the girls builds upon the paper about the boys, so we must start from the beginning. We're going to be talking about the boys first, then we'll get to the girls. I'll be uploading my reading in installments and making them into a playlist for ease of recording, uploading, and viewing. Throughout this document, you're going to hear outdated uses of psychiatry terms, particularly psychopathy, which was used in some old psychiatry texts to describe all disordered personalities and did not yet refer to antisocial personality disorder as it does now. Throughout my translation, I try to keep fairly literal in order to preserve the integrity of Dr. Sukhareva's writing, which means some terminology is going to need to be considered in historical context. In my opinion, Sukhareva's term schizoid psychopathy of childhood is equivalent to what we now call autism, and the contemporary diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder is not meaningfully different from the lower support needs profiles of autism. So without further ado, allow me to start reading you my translation of this century-old document. The Schizoid Psychopathies in Childhood by Dr. Grunya Sukhareva from the Sanatorium School of the Neuropsychology Children's Clinic in Moscow, originally published in Russian in 1925, published in German in 1926. The question of schizoid and bipolar already has a large existing body of literature, and Kretschmer's book Physiology and Personality was the basis for a whole range of different works. When we give an overview of all the material that exists about Kretschmerian typology, it is clear that this question is still in the stage of a clash of different viewpoints. Among the most controversial appears to be the problem of the schizoid character type. The introduction of the schizoid concept into psychiatric clinics was met with serious criticism from many psychiatrists. Bumke considers this term an artificial construct. Wilmans considers the types given by Kretschmer to be vague and poorly defined. In Ewald's opinion, schizoid is a collective term that can encompass all groups of psychopathic personalities. This strict critique of Kretschmer's typology finds its explanation in the vagueness of the schizoid type, which Kretschmer established in his Physiology and Personality. In his characterization of schizoid temperaments, he gives some masterful, artfully described traits of the schizoid psyche. Nevertheless, the term schizoid remains poorly defined and undefined. In a literary style description of individual schizoid types, the clarity of the clinical concept is lost. The boundary between the sick and the healthy, the characterological and the psychotic, becomes blurred. The term schizoid becomes all-encompassing because its relationship to the normal eccentric individual and to other groups of psychopathic personalities is too vague. As always happens with an insufficiently defined and vaguely defined term, the use of the term schizoid was also taken too far. A whole series of new expressions with unclear meanings emerged: schizophile, schizoman, schizoaffine, etc. And, as is always the case, the use of the expression in its broader sense led to the loss of its original meaning. Kretschmer himself points out this danger of broadening the term schizoid and the resulting confusion of the terms in one of his last works. He recommends using this term very carefully and reserving it only for a small group of psychopathic personalities. The second point, which has raised many objections against Kretschmer, is the question about the relationship between schizoid personality disorder and schizophrenia. In Kretschmer's work, Physiology and Personality, the difference between schizoid personality disorder and schizophrenia is not very clear. Kretschmer believes that the transitions from schizoid to schizophrenia are very fluid, and sees the schizophrenic process as merely an intensification of certain constitutional groups. Ewald discusses this question in detail. He considers the parallel that Kretschmer draws between schizoid psychopathy and dementia praecox to be completely arbitrary, and asks what schizophrenics have in common with schizoid psychopaths if the most characteristic symptom of schizophrenia is the progressive disintegration of personality. Bumke also writes about this, reporting that it is impossible for an organic disease, such as dementia praecox, to eventually dilute itself into a normal temperament. On the other hand, it cannot be denied that a whole series of studies, both in the field of genetic biology and in the clinical field, confirm the fact that some connection exists between the group of schizoid psychopathies and schizophrenia. Many authors draw attention to the presence of a particular type of psychopath with schizoid characteristics in schizophrenic families. Clinical research on the pre-psychotic personality of schizophrenics also points to its similarity with the picture of schizoid psychopathies. These clinical and genetic facts have been evaluated differently by different researchers. A number of authors view schizoid psychopathies as the expression of a constitutional anomaly. In contrast, other authors believe that these psychopathies are latent and abortive schizophrenias, and that the pre-psychotic characteristics are nothing other than early schizophrenic symptoms. However, even the proponents of the second viewpoint do not deny the existence of a special type of psychopath with individual schizophrenic peculiarities. Kraepelin views these peculiarities as the result of a uniform development of the interacting mental capacities. This question about the relationship between schizoid and schizophrenia was also revised by Kretschmer in his later works. In The Constitutional Problem in Psychiatry, he writes that schizophrenia in a schizoid does not develop by means of a simple accumulation of schizoid peculiarities. In the inheritance of schizophrenia, the schizoid component is further supplemented by some other hereditary factor. A complementary impulse acting on a germinal mass is still necessary. Here, Kretschmer's viewpoint approaches the views of Kahn, who distinguishes two components in the inheritance of schizophrenia. One, the predisposition to schizoidism, schizoid constitution, and two, the predisposition to the schizophrenic disease process. We see that the concept of schizoid psychopathy, its scope, its content, its clinical significance, the latter in connection with the question about the relationship of schizoid to schizophrenia, was revised and significantly modified by Kretschmer himself. Schizoid psychopathy in this narrow sense is accepted by many clinicians, including those who had objected to Kretschmer. Even Ewald, who had devoted much attention to the critique of Kretschmer's typology, does not deny that there is a group of psychopaths who possess a great psychological similarity to schizophrenics. He explains this symptomological similarity between two very different clinical forms by their common location in certain brain systems. In one of his last works, Berze makes a number of critical remarks, contra Kretschmer, about the schizoid type, but ends with the recognition that there is a group of psychopaths who are particularly predisposed to schizophrenia, and whom he calls the apperceptively hyperexcitable psychopaths. This group represents a constitutional anomaly, which manifests itself in an overexcitation of certain nervous systems, thus explaining their easy vulnerability and the genetic connection with schizophrenia. Similar studies also exist from Kleist's clinic. These authors explain the psychopathic schizoid constitution by the congenital inadequacy of certain parts of the brain, cerebellum, basal ganglia, frontal system, namely those systems which, according to Kleist, must be considered the anatomical substrate of the schizophrenic disease process. The debate about schizoid psychopathies can best be resolved using clinical material, well-studied and continuously observed cases. In this respect, children's material has the advantage of being much purer with regard to various external factors, from the milieu, cultural conditions, professions, alcohol, other narcotics, etc., that obscure the most essential features of the picture. We take into account that cases of childhood psychopathy have been described relatively infrequently in the literature. We are therefore of the opinion that it would not be without interest to document the material regarding schizoid psychopathies that was presented for treatment at the Psychoneurological Children's Clinic over the past 3 years. Since we had to reckon with the differential diagnostic difficulties encountered in distinguishing schizoid psychopathies from the pre-psychotic and post-psychotic personalities of schizophrenics, we selected only those cases for which we possessed thorough case histories and where our observation had extended over a prolonged period. We leave out of consideration here other, less pronounced forms from our clinical material, in which certain diagnostic difficulties might arise. In total, we present below 6 cases of schizoid psychopathy. All cases involve boys aged 2 to 14 years. The average length of stay in the clinic is 2 years.